Nobody heard the splash. That's what stayed with the investigators later. For women, different nights, different weeks, all ending up in the same ditch behind a $15 a night motel. And nobody heard a thing. The water was shallow. Maybe 6 inches of runoff mixed with chemicals and waste from the highway. Just deep enough to blur the edges of what lay beneath. Just deep enough to hide them. For a while. On November 20th, 2006, 2 women decided to take a walk behind the Golden Key Motel in Egg Harbor Township, New Jersey. It was the kind of place people drove past without looking. Peeling paint. Broken neon. The kind of motel where you paid in cash and nobody asked questions. The walk was supposed to be quick. It wasn't. One of the women saw something in the ditch. At first, she thought it was clothing. Maybe a discarded jacket someone had thrown from a car window. But the shape was wrong. The weight of it was wrong. She moved closer. And then she saw the hair. She called 911. Her voice was steady at first. Then it wasn't. The operator asked her to stay on the line. To stay where she was. To not touch anything. But she'd already stepped back. Already turned away. Because once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. The first responders arrived within minutes. They secured the scene. Marked the location. Called for backup. And then they found the second body. Then the third. Then the fourth. All of them face down in the water. All of them positioned the same way. Arms stretched out. Heads turned east, toward the bright lights of Atlantic City, just a few hundred yards away. All of them barefoot. Their shoes were gone. Their socks were gone. Everything else they wore, jeans, shirts, jackets, remained intact. But their feet had been deliberately stripped. The investigators stood in silence for a moment. Because they knew what this meant. This wasn't random. This wasn't a single act of violence. This was a pattern. This was a signature. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy true crime stories like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The bodies were spaced about 60 feet apart, evenly measured, deliberately placed. Someone had taken their time. The ditch ran along a desolate stretch behind a row of cheap motels on the Black Horse Pike. Route 40, a road that cut through the outskirts of Atlantic City, connecting the glitter of the casinos to the forgotten corners where people disappeared without anyone noticing. Where women like these 4 could vanish for weeks. And nobody would file a report. The medical examiner arrived as the sun began to set. The scene was photographed. Evidence markers were placed in the mud. The water was murky, contaminated with runoff from the highway and chemicals from nearby businesses. It made the work harder. It made identification harder. But what was immediately clear was this. The women had been there for different lengths of time. One body, later identified as Kim Raffo, had been in the water for only a couple of days. Her cause of death would later be determined as strangulation. A rope or cord tightened around her throat until she stopped breathing. Another, Tracy and Roberts, had been there for about a week. She'd been asphyxiated, though the exact method was unclear. The other 2 had been there much longer. Barbara Breidor and Molly Diltz. Their bodies were so badly decomposed that the medical examiner couldn't determine a cause of death. Too much time had passed. Too much damage had been done by the water, the elements, the slow erasure of evidence. Barbara had been in that ditch for at least 2 weeks. Maybe longer. And nobody had known she was missing. The news broke fast. By the next morning, camera crews from local stations were parked along the Black Horse Pike. National outlets picked up the story. The headlines wrote themselves. 4 dead women found behind Atlantic City Motel. Serial killer suspected in prostitute murders. Eastbound Strangler leaves trail of bodies. The name stuck. The Eastbound Strangler. Because of the way the bodies were positioned. Heads facing east. Toward the casinos. Toward the boardwalk. Toward the city that never stopped selling the promise of luck. But for these women, luck had run out long before they ended up in that ditch. The Golden Key Motel became the center of the investigation. Police cordoned off the area. Searched the rooms. Interviewed the guests. Most of them were transient. Drifters. People who paid by the night and left no forwarding address. The motel was known for drugs. For prostitution. For the kind of business that happened in the shadows. It was the kind of place where people came to disappear. And for 4 women, it became the place where they were found. Atlantic County Prosecutor Jeffrey Blitz assembled a task force. More than 100 investigators from multiple agencies. FBI, state police, local detectives, They started with the basics. Identify the victims. Trace their last movements. Find out who they'd been with. Where they'd gone. Who might have wanted them dead. The first victim identified was Kim Raffo, 35 years old. From Brooklyn originally. She'd moved to Atlantic City with her boyfriend years earlier, hoping for a fresh start. She had 2 children. She'd once been a member of the PDA in Florida. But by 2006, she was working the streets of Atlantic City. The second identification came 6 days later. Barbara Breidor, 42 years old. She'd been missing since mid-October, but her family hadn't been able to file a formal report. Not right away. The police had asked questions. Asked about her lifestyle. Asked if she had a history. She did. And so the urgency faded. Until her body was pulled from the ditch and identified through dental records. The third victim was Tracy Ann Roberts, 23 years old. Originally from Delaware. She'd trained to be a medical assistant. She had a daughter. Friends said she was trying to get clean. Trying to turn things around. The last time anyone saw her alive, she'd been hit in the throat by a man who wanted to be her pimp. She went to the hospital. Then she disappeared. The fourth victim was the hardest to identify. She'd been in the water the longest. More than a month. Her tattoo was the key. An English bulldog inked on her body. Her family recognized it immediately. Molly Dilts, 20 years old. From a small mining town in Pennsylvania. She'd only been in Atlantic City for 6 weeks. She had no arrests for prostitution. But people on the streets knew her. She'd fallen into the life. Fast and hard. And now she was gone. For women. Ages ranging from 20 to 42. All with different stories. Different backgrounds. Different paths that had led them to the same place. But when the investigators laid out the timeline, a pattern emerged. Molly Dilts had disappeared first. Early October. Barbara Breidor vanished on October 17th. Tracy Ann Roberts went missing in early November. Kim Raffo was last seen on November 19th, the day before the bodies were discovered. Over the span of 5 weeks, someone had been hunting. Someone had been selecting victims from the streets of Atlantic City. Women who were vulnerable. Women who wouldn't be immediately missed. Women whose disappearances wouldn't trigger alarms. Women who had become invisible. And then, methodically, deliberately, this person had killed them. Stripped their feet bare. Positioned them face down in the water. Lined them up like discarded objects. And walked away. The public reaction was immediate. Fear spread through Atlantic City's underground economy. The sex workers who walked the same streets these women had walked began carrying knives. Some left town entirely. Others stayed. Because they had no choice. The casinos kept their lights on. The tourists kept coming. The city's motto, always turned on, remained unchanged. But for the people who lived in the shadows, everything had changed. There was a killer among them. And he was still out there. Before we dive into who Barbara Breidor was, before she became victim number 3, we need to understand something important. This story isn't just about how she died. It's about how she lived. Because Barbara wasn't born into this ending. She didn't start her life in a ditch behind a motel. She started it with promise. With potential. With a family that loved her and a future that seemed bright. Somewhere along the way, things changed. And understanding that change. Understanding how a woman goes from a stable, loving home to a shallow grave. Is the only way to truly tell this story. So we're going to step back. Back before October 2006. Back before the addiction. Before the streets. Before the Golden Key Motel. Back to when Barbara Breidor was just a girl growing up in Pennsylvania. Back to when her family still believed she'd be okay. Huntingdon Valley, Pennsylvania, is the kind of place people dream about when they think of suburban stability. Tree-lined streets. Well-maintained homes. Good schools. Safe neighborhoods where kids ride bikes until the streetlights come on and parents don't lock their doors. Barbara Breidor grew up there in the 1970s and 80s. She was the second of 3 children. Middle child. The mediator. The one who kept the peace when her siblings fought. Her father ran a successful business. Her mother, Lori, later opened a store called Santa Fe Trading Company, a boutique that sold Southwestern-style furniture, art, and home decor. It became popular. Did well. Provided the family with a comfortable life. Barbara attended Catholic school. She wore the uniform. Followed the rules. Earned good grades. But what people noticed most about Barbara wasn't her obedience. It was her mind. She was sharp. Quick-witted. The kind of person who could finish your sentence before you'd figured out how to say it. Her family would gather around the television every evening to watch Jeopardy. It became a ritual, a competition. Barbara almost always won. She'd shout out the answers before the contestants could buzz in. History, literature, science. It didn't matter. She had one of those brains that just absorbed information and held on to it. Her siblings joked that she was the smartest one in the family. It wasn't really a joke. Barbara had the kind of intelligence that opens doors. The kind that leads to scholarships, career opportunities, a life where success feels inevitable. And for a while, that's exactly where her life seemed to be heading. She graduated from high school with honors, applied to Penn State, got in. Her parents were proud. Her future looked bright. Barbara packed her bags and left Huntingdon Valley for State College, Pennsylvania, ready to start the next chapter. She had no way of knowing how that chapter would end. College was good at first. Barbara adapted quickly, made friends, kept up with her classes, came home for holidays with stories about campus life, professors, late-night study sessions. But something shifted during those years. Later, her family would look back and wonder when it started. When the first crack appeared, there were no obvious signs, no dramatic breakdowns, no sudden rebellion, just small changes, subtle withdrawals. She didn't talk about her future as much, didn't share her plans, didn't seem to have the same excitement she'd once had. She graduated, came home, started working at her mother's store. The Santa Fe Trading Company was doing well. Lori needed help managing inventory, assisting customers, keeping the books. Barbara was good at it. Smart, reliable. Customers liked her. She settled into a routine. Work, home, family dinners. On the surface, everything looked fine. But something was missing. That spark, that brightness, that sense of possibility that had once surrounded her. Her family noticed. But they didn't push. They figured she was still finding her way, still figuring out what she wanted. They didn't know that she was already starting to lose something. Something she wouldn't get back. The first real blow came when her father died. Heart disease. Sudden. The kind of death that leaves families reeling because there's no time to prepare. Barbara took it hard. She'd always been close to her father. He was the one who encouraged her academic pursuits, who told her she could do anything, who believed in her potential. And now he was gone. She grieved. But she grieved quietly, kept it inside. Then, a few years later, her half-brother died. 2 major losses in a short span of time. Death has a way of changing people, of making them question what matters, of making them vulnerable in ways they don't recognize until it's too late. For Barbara, those losses created a crack that would eventually become a chasm. She met Steve Frizzell sometime in the late 1990s. He was charming at first, attentive, the kind of boyfriend who made her feel seen. They started dating, spending more time together, building a relationship. But Steve had a problem. He was addicted to prescription painkillers. Not heroin, not cocaine, not the drugs people think of when they imagine addiction. Pills. Legal, when prescribed. Deadly, when abused. Steve took them daily, sometimes multiple times a day. Barbara didn't judge him. She wanted to help. She thought maybe she could be the person who pulled him out of it. That's what people do when they love someone. They believe they can save them. In 1998, Barbara started having severe menstrual pain. The kind of pain that makes it hard to function, to work, to focus on anything else. She needed relief. Steve offered her one of his pills. It was that simple. One pill, one borrowed prescription, one moment of desperation that seemed harmless. The pain went away. And for a while, that was the end of it. But pain has a way of coming back. And pills have a way of becoming a solution. At first, Barbara only took them when the pain was unbearable. Then she started taking them when the pain was just uncomfortable. Then she started taking them when there was no pain at all. Because by that point, her body had changed. It didn't just want the pills anymore. It needed them. When you become dependent on opioids, your body stops producing its own endorphins. The chemicals that regulate pain, mood, pleasure, they shut down. Because the pills are doing the work. So when you stop taking the pills, your body doesn't know how to cope. The pain comes back. Worse than before. Your mood crashes. Your energy disappears. You feel like you're dying. And the only thing that makes it stop is another pill. Barbara tried to get her own prescription. She went to doctors, explained her symptoms. But by the late 1990s, physicians were starting to crack down on opioid prescriptions. They were seeing too many patients becoming addicted, too many overdoses, too many lives destroyed. So they said no. Barbara's pain was real, but the doctors didn't trust it. And without a prescription, she had two choices: suffer through the withdrawal and hope her body would eventually reset, or find another way to get what she needed. Steve was still using, still had access to pills. Barbara started borrowing his, just enough to keep the withdrawal at bay. But pills are expensive on the street, and Steve's supply wasn't unlimited. They started running out. That's when someone told them about heroin. Heroin is cheaper than pills, easier to find, stronger, and it works on the same receptors in the brain. So if you're already addicted to opioids, heroin just becomes the next logical step. Barbara told herself she'd never use a needle. She'd snort it. That was different. That was safer. That was the lie people tell themselves when they're crossing a line they swore they'd never cross. The first time Barbara used heroin, she hated it. It made her sick, nauseous, dizzy, but it also made the withdrawal stop. And that was enough. The second time was easier. The third time, she didn't even hesitate. Within months, she wasn't just using to avoid withdrawal. She was using to feel normal. Her family started to notice changes. She was losing weight, becoming distant, missing family dinners, showing up late to work. Lori confronted her, asked if something was wrong. Barbara said she was fine, just stressed, just tired. Lori wanted to believe her. But mothers know when their children are lying. She just didn't know how bad it had gotten. Not yet. Addiction doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up one day and declare, "Your daughter is a heroin addict now." It creeps in slowly, disguises itself as stress, as depression, as bad luck. By the time you realize what's happening, the person you love is already gone, and someone else is living in their body. Barbara was still Barbara. She still had that sharp mind, that quick wit, but she was also becoming someone else. Someone who lied to get money. Someone who disappeared for days without explanation. Someone who chose the drug over everything else. Because that's what heroin does. It doesn't just change your body. It rewires your brain. It makes the drug the only thing that matters. The only thing worth protecting. Everything else, family, career, dignity, becomes secondary, negotiable, disposable. Barbara and Steve's relationship became toxic. They weren't partners anymore. They were codependents. Two addicts feeding off each other's worst impulses. They fought, made up, fought again. They ran out of money, sold belongings, borrowed from friends who eventually stopped lending. Barbara stopped working at her mother's store. She couldn't keep up with the demands, couldn't focus, couldn't be trusted with the register. Lori didn't fire her. She just stopped scheduling her. Because what else could she do? Barbara moved in and out of Steve's place. Sometimes they were together. Sometimes they weren't. But they always ended up back with each other. Because addiction is lonely. And having someone who understands that loneliness, even if they're drowning too, feels better than facing it alone. By the early 2000s, Barbara's life had shrunk to a single focus. Getting high, staying well, avoiding withdrawal. Everything else faded into the background, including the one person who should have been her reason to stop. Her daughter. Barbara had a daughter named Dominique. The details of Dominique's father are unclear from the records. But what is clear is that Barbara loved her. Even in the depths of addiction, she loved her. But love doesn't cure addiction. And addiction doesn't stop just because you have a child depending on you. Barbara tried. She really did. She'd get clean for a few weeks. Stay sober. Spend time with Dominique. Make promises about the future. And then she'd relapse. And the cycle would start again. By 2001, Dominique was 4 years old. Old enough to notice when her mother was different. When her mother couldn't get out of bed. When her mother disappeared for days. Old enough to be affected by it. Barbara made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She sent Dominique to Florida to live with family members. It wasn't abandonment. That's important to understand. Barbara didn't send her daughter away because she didn't care. She sent her away because she did. She knew she couldn't be the mother Dominique needed. Not in the state she was in. Not with the life she was living. So she made the hardest choice a parent can make. She let someone else raise her child. The family took Dominique in. Gave her stability. Safety. A childhood that didn't revolve around addiction. Barbara called when she could. Sent letters. Made promises about getting clean and bringing Dominique back home. But the years passed. And those promises stayed unfulfilled. Without Dominique, Barbara had nothing left to anchor her. No job. No stable housing. No reason to wake up in the morning and pretend things were okay. She drifted. Atlantic City became her home. Or rather, the streets of Atlantic City became her home. The casinos didn't want her. She wasn't a customer, wasn't a tourist. She was one of the people who existed in the margins, the ones the city wanted to forget. She started working as a prostitute. It's not a word she would have used for herself 5 years earlier. It's not a life she would have imagined. But when you're addicted to heroin, and you have no income, and withdrawal feels like death, you do what you have to do. You sell what you have left. Her first arrest for solicitation came in 2003, then another in 2004, then another. Each time, the same cycle. Arrested, booked, released, back on the streets. Sometimes she'd spend a few days in jail. It was almost a relief. 3 meals, a bed, time to detox. But as soon as she got out, she'd use again. Because the world outside was still the same. The cravings were still there. The emptiness was still there. And the only thing that made it bearable was getting high. Barbara's family tried to help. They really did. Lori offered to pay for rehab. Begged Barbara to come home. Told her it wasn't too late. But you can't force someone into recovery. They have to want it. And Barbara wasn't ready. Or maybe she was. But the drugs were stronger. Her siblings called. Checked in. Asked if she needed anything. She always said she was fine. She never was. By 2006, Barbara had been living on the streets of Atlantic City for years. She'd aged beyond her 42 years. Her face was gaunt. Her teeth were bad. Her body was breaking down from years of abuse. But she was still alive. Still surviving. Still holding on to some small, stubborn part of herself that refused to disappear completely. She stayed with friends when she could. People who were in the same situation. Other addicts. Other sex workers. One of those people was a woman named Lori. Not her mother. A different Lori. Lori lived with her father, Richard Adams, in a duplex in Ventnor, New Jersey, just a few miles from Atlantic City. Richard was elderly. Needed help around the house. Lori offered Barbara a deal. Do some chores, help with cleaning, and you can sleep on the couch. It wasn't much. But it was something. Barbara took it. For a brief moment, she had stability again. A place to sleep. A routine. People who knew her name. She helped Richard with household tasks. Swept the floors. Did the dishes. Made herself useful. In exchange, she had a roof over her head. It wasn't home. But it was close. She still went out at night. Still worked the streets. Still used. But she came back. And for a while, that was enough. October 17th, 2006. A Tuesday. Barbara left the duplex in Ventnor sometime in the afternoon. She told Lori she'd be back later. She never said where she was going. Didn't need to. They both knew. Lori watched her walk down the street. Didn't think much of it. Barbara had left dozens of times before. She always came back. But that night, she didn't. The next day, Lori waited. Nothing. The day after that, still nothing. A week passed. Then 2. Lori started to worry. But she didn't call the police. Not right away. Because women like Barbara disappeared all the time. Sometimes for days. Sometimes for weeks. And they usually came back. Usually. While Barbara Breidor was lying in a shallow ditch behind the Golden Key Motel, her family didn't know she was dead. They didn't know she was missing. They just knew she hadn't called in a while. And for someone like Barbara, that wasn't unusual. When you're estranged from your family because of addiction, communication becomes irregular. Sporadic. Sometimes weeks go by without contact. So when the phone didn't ring, her mother didn't panic. She worried. But she didn't panic. There's a difference. Panic is what happens when you know something is wrong. Worry is what happens when you're afraid something might be wrong, but you're not sure yet. Lori Breidor had been worrying about Barbara for years. This felt like more of the same. November 20th, 2006. The day the bodies were discovered. The news broke across local television stations. 4 women found dead behind a motel in Egg Harbor Township. Lori saw the reports. Read the headlines. Her stomach turned. But the victims hadn't been identified yet. The authorities were still running tests. Still notifying families. So Lori waited. And hoped it wasn't Barbara. 6 days later, the call came. Dental records had confirmed it. One of the bodies was Barbara. Victim number 3. The medical examiner explained that she'd been in the water for at least 2 weeks. Possibly longer. Decomposition had made it impossible to determine a cause of death. No signs of strangulation, like Kim Raffo. No clear evidence of asphyxiation, like Tracy Roberts. Just gone. Lori asked how Barbara had died. The examiner said they didn't know. And they might never know. Grief is strange when it's been waiting in the wings for years. Lori had been preparing for this call in some way. Not consciously. But deep down, in the part of a parent's mind that never stops fearing the worst. She'd imagined overdose, car accident, violence from a customer. But this was different. This wasn't random bad luck. This wasn't a tragic consequence of addiction. This was murder. Someone had killed her daughter, stripped her bare feet, dumped her in a ditch like garbage. And they were still out there. The other families were going through the same nightmare. Kim Raffo's family had been searching for her since late November. They'd filed a missing person report, plastered flyers around Atlantic City. When the bodies were found, they knew immediately it might be her. The dental records confirmed it within days. Kim had been strangled. Cause of death, ligature strangulation. A rope or cord pulled tight until she stopped breathing. She'd only been in the water for 2 days when she was found. She was the most recent victim, the freshest kill. Tracy and Robert's family had also been looking for her. 23 years old. A daughter. A mother herself. She'd been trying to get clean, trying to turn her life around. Her last known interaction was troubling. A man who wanted to be her pimp had hit her in the throat. Hard enough that she went to the hospital. She filed a report, got treated, left, and then she vanished. When her body was pulled from the ditch, the medical examiner found evidence of asphyxiation. But the exact method was unclear. Too much decomposition. She'd been in the water for about a week. Molly Dilts was the youngest, 20 years old. She'd grown up in a small mining town in Pennsylvania. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where families go back generations. Molly had been a bright kid, energetic, full of life. But she'd also struggled. Her mother had died when she was young. She'd bounced between family members, never quite found stable ground. By the time she was a teenager, she was experimenting with drugs. By her early 20s, she was addicted. She moved to Atlantic City in late September 2006, just 6 weeks before she died. She had no prior arrests for prostitution, but people on the streets recognized her. She was new, vulnerable, easy to manipulate. Someone took advantage of that. Molly had been in the water the longest, more than a month. Her body was so badly decomposed that identification took time. The only distinguishing feature was a tattoo, an English bulldog. Her family recognized it immediately. Cause of death, undetermined. Same as Barbara. Too much time, too much damage. The water had taken the evidence with it. For women, for different stories. But when investigators laid out the facts, the similarities were undeniable. All 4 were involved in sex work. All 4 struggled with addiction. All 4 had been working the same stretch of Atlantic City. All 4 had disappeared within a 5-week span. All 4 had been found in the same location, positioned the same way. This wasn't coincidence. This was selection. The Golden Key Motel became ground zero for the investigation. Detectives interviewed everyone who'd stayed there in October and November. Guests, employees, the owner. Most of the guests were gone, moved on, untraceable. But one name kept coming up. A man who'd been staying at the motel during the time the women disappeared. A man who'd reported something strange to the motel staff. His name was Terry Olson. Terry Olson wasn't from Atlantic City. He was from North Dakota. He'd come to New Jersey for work. Stayed at the Golden Key because it was cheap. On November 20th, 2006, the same day the bodies were discovered, Olson had reported to the motel staff that there were boots on the roof. Women's boots. He said he'd seen them while looking out his window. Thought it was odd. Mentioned it to the front desk. The staff didn't think much of it at the time. But when 4 bodies were found behind the motel later that day, suddenly those boots mattered. Police brought Olson in for questioning. He cooperated, answered their questions, explained why he was in New Jersey, provided his work records. He agreed to give DNA samples, hair samples, fingerprints. He took a polygraph test. He passed. The boots on the roof were collected as evidence, tested for DNA. No matches to the victims. No clear connection. But Olson remained a person of interest. Not a suspect. Not yet. Just someone who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe the right place. Depending on who you asked. The media latched onto the story. The Eastbound Strangler. A serial killer targeting sex workers in Atlantic City. The comparisons to other cases were inevitable. The Long Island serial killer. The Grim Sleeper. The Green River Killer. All cases where the victims were women involved in sex work. Women whose disappearances didn't trigger immediate alarms. Women who were easy to forget. Until their bodies piled up. The FBI got involved. Profilers studied the crime scene. Analyzed the behavior. The positioning of the bodies suggested control. Ritual. A need for order. The removal of the shoes suggested a signature. Something personal to the killer. A trophy or a symbolic act. The spacing between the bodies, 60 feet apart, suggested planning. Deliberation. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was methodical. Investigators searched the marshland around the ditch, used cadaver dogs, combed through the reeds and mud. They were looking for evidence. Clothing, personal belongings, anything that might point to a suspect. They found nothing. The ditch was contaminated with runoff from the highway, chemicals from nearby businesses, trash from passing cars. If there had been evidence, the water had destroyed it. Or the killer had been smart enough not to leave any. Witnesses started coming forward. People who'd seen the victims in the days before they disappeared. Someone saw Kim Raffo getting into a dark-colored SUV near the White House sub shop on November 19th. She was wearing a white jacket. She looked cold. She got in willingly. Didn't seem scared. And then the car drove away. Another witness saw Molly Dilts near the same area in early October. She'd been talking to a man. They didn't get a good look at him. Just remembered she seemed to know him. Another sighting. Another vague description. Always a car. Always a man. Always the same general area of Atlantic City. But no names. No plates. No faces. Just shadows. The community reacted in different ways. Some people demanded action. Protested outside City Hall. Held vigils for the victims. Others shrugged. Said these women had taken risks. Put themselves in danger. Said it was tragic, but not surprising. That attitude, that indifference, was part of the problem. When society decides certain lives matter less than others, killers notice. They choose victims who won't be missed, who won't be looked for, who won't generate public outrage. And for a while, they get away with it. By early December, the investigation had slowed. The task force was still working, still following leads. But the leads were drying up. The witnesses couldn't provide enough detail. The forensics were inconclusive. The person of interest had an alibi that checked out. The public's attention started to fade. The news cycle moved on, and the families were left waiting. Lori Breidor wanted answers. She wanted to know who killed her daughter. Wanted to know why. But more than that, she wanted people to understand something important. Barbara wasn't just a statistic. Wasn't just another dead prostitute. She was a person, a daughter, a mother. She'd been valedictorian material in high school. She'd had a future. Yes, she'd made mistakes. Yes, she'd struggled with addiction. But that didn't mean she deserved to die in a ditch. That didn't mean her life didn't matter. Lori started speaking to the media, doing interviews, sharing Barbara's story. She showed pictures of Barbara as a child, as a teenager, before the drugs. She wanted people to see her daughter as a human being, not as a headline, not as a cautionary tale, as someone who'd been loved, who'd been lost. The other families did the same. Kim Raffo's family talked about how she'd been a PDA member, how she'd loved her children, how she'd tried to get clean. Tracy Roberts' family shared stories about her training to be a medical assistant, her sense of humor, her love for her daughter. Molly Dilt's family described a bright, energetic girl who'd faced tragedy too young and never recovered. These women had names, had histories, had people who missed them, and they deserved justice. But justice wasn't coming. Not quickly, anyway. The investigation continued through 2007, then 2008, then 2009. Years passed. The case went cold. Not officially. The file stayed open. The task force never disbanded. But the momentum faded. The tips stopped coming in. The witnesses moved on. The killer, whoever he was, disappeared into the background. And the families were left with questions that might never be answered. In 2010, the Long Island serial killer case broke. Bodies found along Ocean Parkway. Multiple victims. Same pattern. Sex workers, disposed of in isolated areas. Some people wondered if the cases were connected. Investigators looked into it. Compared notes. Analyzed the patterns. But the signatures were different. The methods were different. And eventually, they ruled out a connection. Two different killers. Two different hunting grounds. Just the same kind of victims. In 2023, Rex Hoyerman was arrested for the Long Island murders. The news sent shockwaves through the true crime community. And once again, people asked, could he be connected to the Atlantic City case? Authorities investigated, looked at his travel records, his timeline, and once again, they found no connection. Hoyerman had his own hunting ground, his own pattern. The Eastbound Strangler, whoever he was, remained unidentified. Terry Olson's name resurfaced occasionally over the years. Online sleuths dug into his background, pointed out the timing, the boots, the location, but Olson was never charged. He'd cooperated fully, passed the polygraph, had no prior history of violence, and crucially, there was no physical evidence tying him to the victims. No DNA, no witnesses, no confessions, just suspicion, and suspicion isn't enough. So the case remains unsolved. 18 years later, no arrests have been made. The ditch behind the Golden Key Motel has been filled in. The motel itself has changed ownership multiple times. The physical location where 4 women were found has been altered, erased, but the memory hasn't faded. Not for the families, not for the investigators who worked the case, not for the people who knew these women. Barbara Breidor's daughter, Dominique, grew up in Florida, away from the tragedy, away from the headlines. She knows what happened to her mother, but she also knows who her mother was before addiction took hold. The smart, funny woman who used to win at Jeopardy. The woman who sent her away because she loved her too much to let her suffer. The woman who tried, who failed, who tried again. The woman who deserved better than a shallow ditch. Kim Raffo's children remember a mother who loved them fiercely, who made mistakes, yes, but who never stopped being their mom. Tracy Roberts' daughter carries her mother's memory. Molly Dilt's family still gathers on her birthday, still lights candles, still says her name. Because when the world forgets, families remember. The question that haunts this case isn't just who did it. It's why did it take so long for anyone to notice? 4 women disappeared over 5 weeks. And nobody sounded the alarm. No missing person reports were filed in time. No searches were organized. These women existed in a space where disappearance was almost expected, where being gone for days or weeks was just part of the life. And that's the real tragedy. Not just that they were killed, but that they could be killed and no one noticed. Atlantic City sells a fantasy. Bright lights, slot machines, the promise that tonight could be the night your luck changes. But walk 3 blocks away from the boardwalk, and the fantasy disappears. What's left is a different city. One with boarded-up storefronts and empty lots. Where people sleep on benches and hustle for survival. Where women like Barbara, Kim, Tracy, and Molly work the streets. This is the city tourists don't see. The one the casinos don't advertise. This is where the Eastbound Strangler hunted. The stretch of Atlantic City where the victims were last seen is a roughly 10-block area. Pacific Avenue, Atlantic Avenue, side streets near the White House sub-shop. It's not far from the casinos. You can see the lights from here, but it feels like a different world. During the day, it's quiet, almost abandoned. At night, it comes alive. Cars cruise slowly. Women stand on corners. Transactions happen quickly. Everyone knows what's happening. Police know. City officials know. But enforcement is inconsistent. Arrests happen, sure, but they're catch and release. A night in jail. A fine. Back on the streets. The cycle continues. And the women remain vulnerable. Sex work is dangerous for obvious reasons. You're getting into cars with strangers. Going to locations you don't control. Trusting that the person who just handed you money won't hurt you. Most of the time, it's transactional. Quick. Over in 15 minutes. But sometimes, it's not. Sometimes, the person in the driver's seat has other plans. And by the time you realize it, you're already trapped. The women who work these streets develop survival strategies. They memorize license plates. Text friends with locations. Watch out for each other. But the strategies only work when people are paying attention. And in October and November 2006, something was off. After Kim Raffo's body was found, investigators started interviewing other sex workers in the area. They asked if anyone had noticed anything unusual, any strange clients, any close calls. Some of the women came forward, shared stories. One woman said she'd gotten into a car with a man who seemed normal at first, but then he started driving in the wrong direction. Wouldn't let her out. She jumped from the moving car, broke her wrist, but survived. Another woman said a client had tried to strangle her during sex. She fought back, got away. Another said a man had offered her extra money to get in his car barefoot. Take her shoes off first. She refused. That detail, the shoes, caught investigators' attention, because all 4 victims had been found without shoes. Not just missing, deliberately removed. The removal of shoes is a signature behavior. In criminal profiling, a signature is something the offender does that isn't necessary to commit the crime, but fulfills some psychological need. It's different from an MO, a method of operation. The MO is practical. How the crime is committed. A signature is personal, ritualistic. For the Eastbound Strangler, removing the victim's shoes served no practical purpose. It didn't help him avoid detection. Didn't make disposal easier. It was something he did because it meant something to him. Psychologists theorize it could represent several things. Control. Taking away someone's ability to run or escape. Humiliation. Stripping dignity. Or it could be symbolic of something deeper. A fetish. A memory. A compulsion. Whatever the reason, it was consistent. And consistency is what helps catch serial killers. Until it doesn't. The problem with this case was that the killer had been careful. He didn't leave DNA at the scene. No hair. No fibers. No fingerprints. The bodies had been in the water too long. Any transfer evidence, skin cells, saliva, fluids, had been washed away. The victims had no defensive wounds. No signs they'd fought back. That suggested they'd been incapacitated before death. Possibly drugged. Toxicology reports showed drugs in some of the victims' systems. But all 4 women were users. So distinguishing between self-administered drugs and drugs given by the killer was impossible. Forensically, the case was a nightmare. Detectives turned to victimology, studying the victims' lives to find connections. All 4 were sex workers. That was the obvious link. But were they working for the same pimp? Staying at the same locations? Sharing the same clients? The answer was no. Kim Raffo worked independently. Had her own network. Barbara Breidor had been in the life longer. Had her own routine. Tracy Roberts was newer to Atlantic City. Still finding her way. Molly Dilts was the newest. Barely 6 weeks in the area. They didn't know each other well. Maybe passing acquaintances. But not friends. They weren't connected by relationships. Only by vulnerability. The killer had chosen them for the same reason predators always choose certain victims. They were accessible. Isolated. Unlikely to be immediately missed. The sex worker community is transient. Women move from city to city. Disappear for days. Come back. Leave again. So when someone doesn't show up for a few days, it's not automatically alarming. Maybe she got arrested. Maybe she went to another city. Maybe she's staying with a client. By the time anyone realizes she's actually gone, the trail is cold. The killer knew this. And he exploited it. Detectives interviewed dozens of potential witnesses. Other sex workers. Motel staff. Regular customers. Everyone had theories. Nobody had facts. One woman said she'd seen a dark SUV cruising the area multiple times in October. Said the driver watched the women but never stopped. Another witness said they'd seen a man arguing with one of the victims near Pacific Avenue. Someone else reported a client who'd gotten aggressive. Demanded things. Made threats. Each lead was followed. Each name was checked. And each one led nowhere. Because in a community built on anonymity, identifying one specific person is nearly impossible. Especially when that person doesn't want to be found. The investigative team expanded their search. They looked at similar cases in nearby cities. Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore. Were there other bodies? Other dumping grounds? Other barefoot victims? They found cases that shared some similarities, but none that matched exactly. They contacted other jurisdictions, shared information, built databases. But the Eastbound Strangler, if that was even one person, seemed to have operated in Atlantic City and stopped. Or moved on. Or changed his pattern. Serial killers don't always keep killing. Some stop for years. Some stop permanently. Some get arrested for something else. Some die. Some just stop. And when they stop, the cases go cold. By 2008, the investigation had reached a standstill. The leads had been exhausted. The witnesses had shared everything they knew. The physical evidence, what little there was, had been tested and retested. No new information was coming in. The task force was scaled back. Resources were redirected to other cases. The file stayed open, but the active pursuit slowed, and the families watched their hope fade. Lori Breidor became an advocate. She started speaking at events, talking about Barbara's case, pushing for justice. She wanted people to understand that her daughter's life mattered, that all 4 women's lives mattered. She partnered with organizations that worked with sex workers, addiction recovery programs, victim advocacy groups. She channeled her grief into action, because sitting still felt like giving up, and she refused to give up on Barbara. Kim Raffo's family did the same. They held annual memorials, raised money for reward funds, kept the case in the public eye. They refused to let Kim be forgotten. Tracy Roberts and Molly Dilt's families grieved more quietly, but no less deeply. Each family processed the loss in their own way, but they all shared the same burden. The burden of unanswered questions. Who killed them? Why? Was it someone they knew? A regular client? A stranger? Was it planned? Or opportunistic? Did the killer live in Atlantic City? Or was he just passing through? Was he still alive? Still out there? Had he killed before? Killed since? These questions haunted the families. They haunted the investigators. And they remain unanswered. Over the years, amateur detectives and true crime enthusiasts took up the case. Online forums dedicated to unsolved murders dissected every detail. They created timelines, analyzed photographs, developed theories. Some believed Terry Olson was the killer, pointed to the timing, the boots, the proximity. Others believed it was someone else entirely. A trucker, a local, a regular client. Some thought it might be connected to other cases despite official denials. Everyone had an opinion. Nobody had proof. In 2017, a documentary filmmaker reached out to the families. Wanted to tell the story, bring attention back to the case. The families agreed, participated in interviews, shared photographs, opened old wounds. The documentary aired on a streaming platform, generated some interest. A few tips came in, were followed up on. Nothing panned out, but the families appreciated the effort, appreciated that someone still cared, that their daughters, their sisters, their mothers weren't completely forgotten. The city of Atlantic City has changed since 2006. Some casinos have closed. Others have rebranded. The area where the women were last seen looks different now. More development, more surveillance cameras. The sex work industry is still there, but it's shifted, moved online, become less visible. The women who work today face different dangers, but the vulnerability remains the same. The predators just adapt. The Golden Key Motel changed ownership in 2011. New management tried to distance themselves from the history, renovated the rooms, changed the name briefly, changed it back, but locals still remember, still know it as the place where 4 women were found. Some people won't stay there, won't even drive past it. Others don't care, or don't know. The past fades when it's convenient. But for some, it never fades at all. The ditch where the bodies were found was eventually filled in. The marshland was developed, turned into something else. The physical location no longer exists in the form it did in 2006. But the memory of what happened there remains, embedded in the soil, in the water table, in the collective consciousness of everyone who knew. You can't bury a memory. You can only try. Barbara Breidor would be 60 years old now if she'd lived. She could have been a grandmother, could have reconnected with Dominique, could have gotten clean, could have, but she never got the chance. Neither did Kim, neither did Tracy, neither did Molly. Their lives were cut short by someone who saw them as disposable, someone who believed they wouldn't be missed, wouldn't be mourned, wouldn't matter. That person was wrong. The families matter. Dominique matters. She grew up without her mother. She carries that absence every day. Kim's children matter. They lost their mom. They grew up with questions they'll never have answered. Tracy's daughter matters. She was robbed of a future with her mother. Molly's family matters. They lost a young woman who'd barely begun her adult life. These aren't abstract victims in a news story. These are real people whose absence created real voids. And those voids don't close just because time passes. Addiction complicates grief. When someone dies from an overdose, families sometimes feel a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that the suffering is over. Guilt for feeling that relief. Anger at the choices that led to the addiction. But this is different. Barbara didn't die from an overdose. She was murdered. Someone took her life, made a deliberate choice to end it. And that changes the grief entirely. Because there's no ambiguity. No, what if she'd just... Someone killed her. And that someone is still out there, living their life. While Barbara's ended. The investigators who worked this case, many of them retired now, still think about it. Still wonder if they missed something. If there was a lead they should have followed harder. If they'd moved faster, could they have saved one of the women? 2 of them? Could they have stopped the killer before he finished? These are the questions that keep detectives up at night. The unsolved cases. The ones that got away. Not because they didn't try, but because sometimes trying isn't enough. The Atlantic County Prosecutor's Office still maintains the case files. Still accepts tips. Still follows up on new information when it comes in. The case isn't closed. It's just cold. And cold cases sometimes go hot again. New technology. New witnesses. Deathbed confessions. It happens. Not often, but sometimes. The families hold on to that hope. That one day, the phone will ring. And someone will say, "We got him." That day hasn't come yet. But it still could. In the true crime community, the Atlantic City Four, as they're sometimes called, remain a mystery. A case that seems solvable, but hasn't been solved. A pattern that seems clear, but hasn't led to an arrest. A killer who was bold enough to leave 4 bodies in the same location, but careful enough to leave no trace. It's the kind of case that frustrates people, that makes them dig deeper, search harder, because it feels like the answer is right there, just out of reach. But the truth is, some cases don't get solved. Not because of incompetence, not because of lack of effort, but because the killer got lucky, or smart, or both. Because witnesses didn't see enough. Because evidence degraded. Because time ran out. The justice system isn't perfect. And sometimes, the bad guys win. At least temporarily. Barbara Breidor deserved better. She deserved a life free from addiction. A chance to watch Dominique grow up. A chance to rebuild. She deserved to grow old. To make amends. To find peace. Instead, she got a shallow ditch. A murder that couldn't be solved. A grave that took too long to mark. Kim deserved better. Tracy deserved better. Molly deserved better. They all did. And somewhere, someone knows what happened to them. Someone knows who did this. Maybe it's the killer himself. Maybe it's someone who suspected but said nothing. Maybe it's someone who saw something that night and didn't realize what it meant. But someone knows. And until they speak, these 4 women remain in limbo. Not just victims of violence, but victims of silence. There's a term in criminology, the less dead. It refers to victims who society deems less worthy of attention, less worthy of investigation, less worthy of justice. Sex workers, addicts, the homeless, runaways, people living on the margins. When they disappear, the urgency is different. The resources allocated are different. The public outcry is different, or often non-existent. This isn't a conspiracy. It's not a deliberate policy. It's something more insidious. A subconscious calculation about whose life matters more. And predators know this. They target the less dead specifically because they can get away with it longer. The Green River Killer murdered at least 49 women in Washington state during the 1980s and 90s. Most were sex workers. He later admitted in interviews that he chose sex workers deliberately. Because, in his words, "I thought I could kill as many as I wanted without getting caught." He was almost right. It took nearly 20 years to catch him. The Long Island serial killer targeted sex workers for the same reason. So did the Grim Sleeper in Los Angeles. So did the Chicago Strangler. The pattern repeats because it works. Society's indifference becomes the killer's shield. In Atlantic City, that indifference was on full display. When Kim Raffo was last seen on November 19th, getting into a dark SUV, nobody called police. When Tracy Roberts disappeared after being assaulted by a pimp, nobody followed up aggressively. When Barbara vanished from Lori's duplex, nobody filed a missing person report immediately. When Molly Dilt stopped showing up on her usual corner, nobody sounded an alarm. These women moved through a world that had already written them off. And when they died, that world acted surprised. But here's the thing people forget. These women didn't just appear on the streets of Atlantic City, fully formed as addicts and sex workers. They had childhoods, families, dreams. Barbara was a straight-A student who dominated at Jeopardy. Kim was a PDA member in Florida. Tracy was training to be a medical assistant. Molly was a bright kid from a small town who lost her mother too young. They were daughters, sisters, mothers. They had value before addiction, and they had value after. But somewhere along the way, the world stopped seeing it. Addiction is a disease, not a moral failing. This isn't a controversial statement in medical communities. But in practice, addicts are still treated as if they've chosen their circumstances. As if Barbara woke up one day and decided, "I think I'll become a heroin addict and ruin my life." Nobody chooses that. What they choose is relief from pain, escape from trauma, a few hours of feeling normal. The addiction comes later, uninvited, uncontrollable, and by the time they realize they're trapped, getting out feels impossible. Barbara tried to get clean multiple times. Her family would later recount periods where she'd disappear into rehab, come out hopeful, stay sober for weeks or months. Then something would trigger her. Stress, loss, loneliness, and she'd use again. Each relapse felt like a failure. To her. to her family. But relapse is part of the disease, not a character flaw. Recovery isn't linear. It's messy, full of setbacks. Some people make it, some don't. Barbara didn't. But not because she didn't try. The sex work was survival. That's what people miss when they reduce these women to a label. Prostitute, hooker, streetwalker. The words carry judgment, imply choice, ignore desperation. When you're addicted to heroin and withdrawal feels like death, and you have no money, no job, no support system, what options do you have? You do what you have to do to survive the next few hours. You sell what you can. And for women, that often means selling their bodies. It's not glamorous. It's not empowering. It's survival. The clients who paid these women weren't monsters. Mostly, they were regular people. Businessmen, truckers, married men, young men, people who wanted something transactional, quick, anonymous. Most of the time, it went fine. Money exchanged, service provided, done. But every single transaction carried risk, because the women were vulnerable. And vulnerability attracts predators. Not all clients. Not most clients. But some. And you never knew which one it would be until it was too late. The women developed survival skills. They'd share information about bad clients. Men who got rough. Men who didn't pay. Men who got aggressive. They'd watch out for each other when they could. But the nature of the work made protection difficult. You're getting into a stranger's car. Going to an unknown location. Alone. If something goes wrong, help isn't coming quickly. By the time anyone realizes you're in danger, you're already gone. That's what happened to Barbara. To Kim. To Tracy. To Molly. They got into the wrong car. Or they went to the wrong place. Or they trusted the wrong person. And they never came back. In the weeks after the bodies were discovered, other sex workers in Atlantic City changed their behavior. Some left the area entirely. Too dangerous. Too scary. Others stayed, but became more cautious. Worked in pairs. Avoided certain clients. Some carried weapons. Knives. Pepper spray. The fear was real. Tangible. Because if the killer had done this to 4 women, he could do it again. And nobody knew if he'd stopped. Or if he was just taking a break. Months passed. Then a year. Then 2. No new bodies were found in Atlantic City. No similar cases with the same signature. The killer had either stopped, moved, or changed his pattern. Maybe he'd been arrested for something else. Maybe he'd died. Maybe he'd gotten scared after the discovery. Or maybe he was just patient. Serial killers don't always operate on a schedule. Some kill in clusters. Some wait years between victims. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, went silent for decades before resurfacing. The Zodiac killer stopped communicating and was never caught. Stopping doesn't mean reformed. It just means stopped. The Atlantic City case remains officially unsolved. But unofficially, investigators have theories. They believe it was likely one person. A serial offender. They believe he had access to a vehicle. Probably lived in or near Atlantic City. They believe he targeted vulnerable women deliberately. They believe the removal of shoes was a signature that mattered to him personally. They believe he may have stopped because of the heat generated by the discovery. But beliefs aren't evidence. And without evidence, there's no arrest. No trial. No conviction. Just theories. Terry Olson's name still surfaces in online discussions about the case. He was at the motel. He reported the boots. He matched the general time frame. But he cooperated fully with police. Provided samples. Passed a polygraph. No physical evidence connected him to any of the victims. Could he still be the killer? Theoretically, yes. Polygraphs aren't foolproof. DNA can be absent from crime scenes for many reasons. But suspicion without evidence isn't justice. And Olson was never charged. So either he's innocent and was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, or he's guilty and got away with it. We may never know which. The families have learned to live with uncertainty. It's not closure. It's not peace. It's just acceptance that the answers they want may never come. Lori Breidor has aged since Barbara's death. The grief has marked her. But she continues to speak about Barbara. To keep her memory alive. Not as a victim. As a person. As her daughter. She talks about Barbara's intelligence. Her humor. Her love for her own daughter. She talks about the disease that took hold of her. The struggles she faced. And she talks about the fact that Barbara deserved to live. Deserved a chance to recover. To rebuild. To be a mother to Dominique. Instead, someone took that chance away. Dominique is an adult now. She has memories of her mother, but they're fragmentary. Impressions more than moments. She knows the story. Knows what happened. But she also knows she can't change it. She's built a life for herself. In Florida, far from Atlantic City, she carries her mother's loss with her. Always will. But she hasn't let it define her. That's its own kind of resilience. Kim Raffo's children have done the same. They've grown up, moved forward. They remember their mother, honor her memory, but they've also had to accept that they'll never know who killed her, never understand why. Tracy Roberts' daughter carries the same burden, as does Molly Dilt's family. They've all had to find ways to live with the unanswered questions, because the alternative, being consumed by the need for answers, would destroy them, and the killer would win twice. Every year on November 20th, the anniversary of the discovery, the families gather, sometimes together, sometimes separately. They light candles, share memories, say the names. Barbara Breidor, Kim Raffo, Tracy and Roberts, Molly Dilts. For women who deserved better than the ending they got. The gatherings are small, quiet, no media, no fanfare, just family, and the people who still care. Because even when the world forgets, family remembers. The media coverage of the case has diminished over the years. Anniversaries used to generate stories, updates, renewed calls for information. But as time passes, the coverage shrinks. 5 years after the murders, it was a brief mention. 10 years, a small article in the local paper. 15 years, barely a paragraph. Now, approaching 20 years, most people in Atlantic City don't remember. Or if they do, it's vague. Something that happened a long time ago. The case has become part of the city's dark history. Like the corruption scandals. Like the economic decline. Something acknowledged. Then moved past. But for the people who knew these women, time doesn't erase anything. The wounds don't heal. They just become part of the landscape. A permanent ache that you learn to carry. Lori Breidor still has Barbara's belongings. Photographs. Childhood drawings. Letters. She keeps them in boxes. Looks through them sometimes. Remembers who Barbara was before everything fell apart. That's the Barbara she chooses to remember. Not the woman found in a ditch. The girl who wanted Jeopardy. The daughter who made her laugh. That's who Barbara was. The addiction was something that happened to her. Not who she was. This distinction matters. Because when we reduce people to their worst moments, their lowest points, we erase their humanity. Barbara was more than an addict. More than a prostitute. She was a whole person. With strengths and flaws. Hopes and fears. She made mistakes. She suffered. She tried to survive. And someone killed her for it. That's the story. Not the addiction. Not the sex work. The murder. And the fact that the murderer was never caught. Cold cases haunt investigators in a way that solved cases don't. When you catch the killer, there's closure. Not complete. Victims are still dead, but at least there's accountability. When you don't catch them, the failure lingers. Every detective who worked the Atlantic City case carries it with them. They still think about the crime scene. The victims. The leads that went nowhere. They wonder if they missed something. If they could have done more. The answer is probably no. They did everything they could with what they had. But that doesn't make it easier. Some investigators believe the case could still be solved. Advances in DNA technology have cracked cold cases decades old. Genealogical databases. Touch DNA. New testing methods. If there's any biological evidence left, even trace amounts, it could be tested with today's technology. And maybe, just maybe, it would point to a name. But that requires resources, funding, political will. And cold cases involving sex workers don't always get those things. Not because investigators don't care, but because budgets are limited. And priorities shift. Active cases take precedence. Recent murders. High-profile crimes. The old cases wait. The Atlantic County Prosecutor's Office maintains that the investigation remains open. They still accept tips. Still follow up on credible information. But without new leads, there's only so much they can do. They can't investigate shadows. Can't arrest theories. They need evidence. Witnesses. Something concrete. And so far, that hasn't materialized. The killer, if they're still alive, is living with what they did. Maybe they feel remorse. Maybe they don't. Maybe they think about it every day. Maybe they've moved on. Maybe they're terrified of being caught. Maybe they think they're safe. We don't know. What we do know is that they took 4 lives. Devastated 4 families. And walked away. For now. But here's the thing about secrets. They're heavy. And the longer you carry them, the heavier they get. People who know things, who've seen things, often reach a point where the burden becomes unbearable. Deathbed confessions happen. Guilt catches up. Relationships break down and someone talks. It's not guaranteed, but it's possible. And possibility is what keeps cold cases alive. Someone knows what happened behind the Golden Key Motel. Maybe it's the killer. Maybe it's someone who saw something that night but didn't realize its significance. Maybe it's someone who heard a confession but didn't believe it. Maybe it's someone who suspected but stayed silent out of fear or loyalty. But someone knows. And if they're reading this, if they're listening, it's not too late to speak. Not too late to give these families the answers they deserve. Not too late to let Barbara, Kim, Tracy, and Molly rest. Atlantic City has always been a city of contradictions. Wealth and poverty, glamour and decay, hope and desperation. The casinos promise transformation, a chance to win big, to change your life overnight. But for most people, the promise is a lie. The house always wins. The lights stay on. And the people who came hoping for something better leave with less than they started with. Barbara Breidor came to Atlantic City hoping for something, too. Not fortune, not fame, just survival. A place where she could work, where she could feed her addiction, where she could exist without judgment. But Atlantic City took from her the same way it takes from everyone. It took her dignity, her safety, her life, and then it forgot about her. The city has tried to reinvent itself multiple times over the years. New casinos, new attractions, new marketing campaigns. Do AC was one slogan, meant to rebrand the city as modern, exciting, safe. But beneath the surface, the same problems persist. Poverty, addiction, crime. The streets where Barbara worked still exist. The women who walk them still face the same dangers. Different faces, same vulnerabilities. The Eastbound Strangler may have stopped, but the conditions that made his crimes possible haven't changed. In the years after the murders, Atlantic City did make some changes. Increased police presence in areas known for prostitution. Outreach programs for sex workers. Needle exchanges. Addiction services. Not because the city suddenly cared more, but because 4 bodies in a ditch generate bad publicity. And bad publicity hurts tourism. The changes were real, but the motivation was complicated. Were they trying to protect vulnerable women? Or protect the city's image? Maybe both. Maybe that's as good as it gets. The sex workers who survived that period remember the fear. They remember the heightened police presence. The news helicopters. The questions. They remember being told to be careful, to watch out, to report anything suspicious. But they also remember that the concern faded. After a few months, the extra patrols decreased. The outreach programs lost funding. Life returned to normal, or what passed for normal on the streets of Atlantic City. And the women were left to protect themselves. There's a pattern to how society responds to violence against marginalized people. First, there's shock, outrage, promises of change. Then, time passes. Attention shifts. Resources dwindle. And eventually, people forget. Not the families, not the victims, but everyone else. We saw it with the Atlantic City case. We've seen it in countless others. The Highway of Tears in Canada. Dozens of Indigenous women disappeared over decades. The Chicago Strangler. At least 51 black women murdered between 2001 and 2018. The Albuquerque murders. 11 women, mostly sex workers, found in the desert. Cases that should have generated massive investigations. National attention. Sustained effort. But didn't. Because the victims were deemed less important. This is an ancient history. It's ongoing. Right now, there are women working the streets in cities across America. They're vulnerable. They're at risk. And when they disappear, the response is often muted. Not because investigators don't care. Many do. Genuinely. But because the system doesn't prioritize these cases the same way. A missing college student generates immediate media attention. Amber alerts. Search parties. A missing sex worker generates a report. Maybe a brief investigation. The disparity is real. Measurable. Deadly. Barbara Breidor's case illustrates this perfectly. She disappeared on October 17, 2006. Her body wasn't found until November 20th. That's 34 days. If she'd been a college student, the search would have started immediately. Her face would have been on every news channel. But because she was an addict and a sex worker, nobody noticed she was gone. Not right away. By the time her body was identified, she'd been dead for weeks. And the trail was ice cold. That delay matters. Those lost weeks matter. They're the difference between catching a killer and losing them forever. The other victims faced the same indifference. Kim Raffo was last seen on November 19th. Her body was found the next day, but nobody had reported her missing. Nobody was looking for her. If someone had been, maybe she could have been found alive. Tracy Roberts disappeared after being assaulted by a pimp. She went to the hospital, filed a report, then she vanished. The assault investigation wasn't connected to her disappearance immediately. Another missed opportunity. Molly Dilts had been in Atlantic City for 6 weeks. She had no local connections. No one tracking her movements. She could disappear without a ripple. And she did. These gaps, these failures of awareness, are systemic. They're not the fault of individual officers or investigators. They're the result of how society values certain lives over others. And until that changes, predators will continue to exploit the gaps. They'll continue to target the vulnerable, the marginalized, the invisible, because they know they can get away with it. At least for a while. Some progress has been made. There's more awareness now than there was in 2006. The term missing white woman syndrome has entered the public conversation. Documentaries have highlighted cases of murdered indigenous women, black women, sex workers. Organizations have formed to advocate for victims who would otherwise be forgotten. The paradigm is shifting, slowly, but it's not enough. Not yet. Because for every case that gets attention, dozens more go unnoticed. For every family that gets answers, hundreds more wait in limbo. The system is still broken, and people are still dying because of it. Barbara Breidor's story should have been different. She should have had access to better addiction treatment. Not just detox, but comprehensive care. She should have had economic opportunities that didn't involve selling her body. She should have been treated as a human being deserving of protection, not as a criminal to be arrested and released. And when she disappeared, someone should have noticed immediately. But none of those things happened. And so she ended up in a ditch, face down in shallow water, barefoot, forgotten, until 2 women walking behind a motel stumbled upon her body and 3 others. The discovery shocked people, but it shouldn't have. The conditions were always there. The vulnerability was always there. What was missing was attention, resources, care. And by the time those things arrived, after the bodies were found, it was too late. You can't resurrect the dead. You can only try to prevent more deaths. Atlantic City tried. For a while. But sustained change requires sustained effort. And sustained funding. And politically, economically, that's hard to maintain. Especially when the victims are people society would rather not think about. The families of the 4 women don't have the luxury of looking away. They live with this every day. Every birthday that passes without celebration. Every holiday without their loved one present. Every milestone, graduations, weddings, grandchildren, that the victims never got to experience. The absence is permanent, unyielding, and it's made worse by the lack of answers. Closure is an overused word. People say it like it's a switch you can flip. Catch the killer, get closure. Solve the case, move on. But it doesn't work that way. Even if the Eastbound Strangler were caught tomorrow, tried and convicted, the families wouldn't suddenly be whole again. Their daughters would still be gone. The years would still be lost. What they would have is accountability. Acknowledgement. Justice. Not closure. But something. And right now, they don't even have that. The absence of justice compounds the trauma. It's not just grief. It's unresolved grief. It's the knowledge that someone got away with murder. That they could be living a normal life. Going to work. Spending time with family. While Barbara, Kim, Tracy, and Molly are gone forever. That imbalance, that injustice, eats at the families. It's a wound that can't heal. Not fully. Not while the killer walks free. There are people who argue that cold cases should be left alone. That resources should focus on current crimes. Active threats. That you can't solve everything. Can't save everyone. And they're not wrong. Resources are finite. Choices have to be made. But abandoning a case sends a message. It says that some victims don't matter enough to keep trying. That some families don't deserve answers. That some killers can commit murder and get away with it if they just wait long enough. That's a message society can't afford to send. Not if we claim to value human life. All human life. The Atlantic City case remains solvable. That's what investigators say. What cold case experts believe. Solvable doesn't mean easy. But it means possible. New DNA techniques. Genealogical databases. Witnesses who might talk now that didn't talk then. Technology changes. People change. Someone who was afraid to speak in 2006 might be willing now. Someone who was loyal to the killer then might have cut ties. Someone who didn't realize what they knew mattered might suddenly make a connection. Cold cases warm up. Sometimes. It requires effort, attention, resources. But it's possible. There have been breakthroughs in other cases that seemed just as hopeless. The Golden State Killer was caught in 2018 through genealogical DNA, decades after his crimes. Countless rape kits that sat untested for years have been processed, leading to arrests. Witnesses have come forward in cases that were 30, 40 years old. It happens. Not often enough. But it happens. And it could happen here. The question is whether anyone is still looking. Whether the Atlantic County Prosecutor's Office is still actively investigating. Whether they're using new technologies. Revisiting old evidence. Or whether the case is technically open but functionally dormant. That distinction matters. An open case that's being worked is one thing. An open case that's sitting in a file cabinet is another. And families deserve to know which one they're dealing with. Transparency helps. Even when the news is bad. If investigators said, "We've done everything we can. The case is cold and we don't have new leads," that would be honest. Painful but honest. If they said, "We're still working it. Still following up. Still hoping for a break," that would be encouraging. What's hardest is the ambiguity. The not knowing. Are they trying? Have they given up? Should we keep hoping? Families need something to hold on to. Even if it's just honesty. Lori Breidor has been asking these questions for 18 years. She's called. She's emailed. She's shown up in person. Sometimes she gets updates. Sometimes she doesn't. Sometimes the investigators are sympathetic and engaged. Sometimes they're bureaucratic and distant. It varies. But she keeps asking. Keeps pushing. Because if she doesn't, who will? The other families do the same. They're the ones who keep the case alive. Not the media. Not the public. Not even the police, necessarily. The families. They're the ones who won't let it die. Who won't let Barbara, Kim, Tracy, and Molly be forgotten. Who won't let the killer fade into obscurity. That's their burden. Their responsibility. One they never asked for, but carry anyway. And they carry it alone, mostly. There are support groups for families of homicide victims. Organizations that help. But those resources are limited. Often underfunded. And the families still spend most of their time navigating the grief on their own. Wondering. Waiting. Hoping. It's exhausting. Emotionally draining. But they don't have a choice. Because giving up feels like betraying the person they lost. So they keep going. 18 years is a long time to wait for justice. Long enough for children to grow up. For careers to change. For people to age. Dominique was 4 when her mother disappeared. She's 22 now. She's lived more of her life without Barbara than with her. The memories she has are fading. Being replaced by stories. Photographs. That's the cruelty of time. It doesn't just pass. It erases. Not intentionally, but inevitably. And one day, there won't be anyone left who remembers Barbara as a living person. Just as a case file. A statistic. A victim. Unless the story is told. And retold. And remembered. That's why these stories matter. Not just for the families. But for everyone. Because Barbara's story is also a story about how we treat addiction. How we treat sex workers. How we treat the vulnerable. It's a mirror. And what it reflects isn't pretty. But maybe, if enough people look at it, something will change. Maybe the next Barbara won't fall through the cracks. Maybe the next time someone disappears, someone will notice right away. Maybe the next killer won't get to claim 4 victims before anyone connects the dots. Maybe. That's the hope, anyway. The fragile, uncertain hope that tragedy can lead to change. It doesn't always. But sometimes. And sometimes is better than never. Let's go back to Barbara for a moment. Not the Barbara who was found in a ditch. Not victim number 3. The Barbara who existed before any of this happened. The girl who sat at the dinner table with her family, shouting answers at the television. The one who got excited about college. Who worked at her mother's store. Who had a daughter she loved more than anything. That Barbara. Because that's who was lost. Not just a body. Not just a case number. A person. A whole person. With memories. With potential. With people who loved her. There's a photograph of Barbara that her family shares sometimes. She's young in it. Maybe late 20s. Before the addiction took full hold. She's smiling. Really smiling. The kind of smile that reaches your eyes. She looks happy. Healthy. Alive. When you see that photograph, you can imagine the life she could have had. The version where she got clean. Where she raised Dominique. Where she grew old. That version existed. It was possible. It just didn't happen. And that's the tragedy. Not just that she died, but that she never got to live the life she could have lived. The same is true for Kim Raffo. She was 35 when she died. Still young. Still had decades ahead of her. She could have watched her children graduate, become a grandmother, found peace. But someone decided she didn't get to have those things. Tracy Roberts was only 23. 23. Her entire adult life was ahead of her. Milestones she'd never reach. Experiences she'd never have. Gone. Molly Dilts was even younger. 20 years old. She'd barely started living. And it was over before it really began. These weren't old women at the end of long lives. These were young and middle-aged women who should still be here. Should still be alive. Still be part of their families' lives. But they're not. And someone is responsible for that. Someone made the choice to end their lives. And that person has never been held accountable. 18 years. That's how long the families have been waiting. 18 years of birthdays without their loved ones. 18 years of holidays with empty chairs at the table. 18 years of wondering, hoping, grieving, and still no answers. No arrest. No trial. No conviction. Just silence. The kind of silence that weighs on you. That becomes part of your daily existence. The kind you learn to live with because you have no other choice. But silence can be broken. That's the message the families want people to understand. Even after 18 years. Even after all this time. Someone, somewhere, knows something. Maybe they don't realize it. Maybe they've convinced themselves it doesn't matter. Maybe they're scared. Maybe they're conflicted. But they know something. And that something could be the piece that solves this. That brings justice. That gives these families what they've been waiting for. It could be a detail that seemed insignificant at the time. A conversation overheard. A person acting strangely. A vehicle seen in the wrong place at the wrong time. It could be someone who suspected something but didn't want to believe it. A friend. A family member. A partner. It could be someone who was afraid to come forward then, but isn't anymore. Relationships end. Loyalties shift. Fear fades. People talk. Eventually. Sometimes it just takes time. The Atlantic County Prosecutor's Office is still accepting tips. The case is still open. Still active. Anyone with information about the deaths of Barbara Breidor, Kim Raffo, Tracy and Roberts, or Molly Dilts is urged to contact them. The number is 609-909-7800. Tips can be anonymous. You don't have to give your name. You just have to tell them what you know, or what you think you know, even if it seems small, even if you're not sure it matters. Let them decide. Let them follow up. Because you might have the piece that breaks this open. There's also a website. A place where people can submit information electronically. It's easier for some people. More comfortable. More private. The point is, there are options. There are ways to help. And help is what these families need. 18 years is long enough. These women deserve justice. Their families deserve answers. And whoever did this deserves to be held accountable. Before we finish, if this story affected you, if you think others should hear it, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who cares about true crime and unsolved cases. The more people who know about Barbara, Kim, Tracy, and Molly, the better the chance that someone with information will come forward. Your share could be the one that makes the difference. Serial killers don't stop because they feel guilty. They stop because they get caught, or because circumstances force them to stop. The Eastbound Strangler stopped, or appeared to stop. Maybe the discovery of the body scared him, made him realize he was taking too much risk. Maybe he moved to another city, started over. Maybe he got arrested for something else. Maybe he died. Or maybe he's still out there, living a normal life, going to work, interacting with people who have no idea what he's done. That's the thing about serial killers. They're not monsters in the literal sense. They're people. They blend in. They function in society. That's what makes them so dangerous and so hard to catch. But they can be caught. Time doesn't erase DNA, doesn't erase evidence. And people who keep secrets eventually crack. It might take decades, but it happens. The Golden State Killer thought he'd gotten away with it. Lived free for 40 years. Until he didn't. The same could happen here. Will happen here. If the right information comes forward. If the right person speaks up. If someone decides that justice matters more than silence. The families will keep waiting. They don't have a choice. Lori Breidor will keep advocating for her daughter. Keep telling Barbara's story. Keep pushing for answers. Kim's family will do the same. Tracy's. Molly's. They won't stop. Can't stop. Because stopping means giving up. and they'll never give up on the people they lost. But they shouldn't have to do this alone. Society failed these women when they were alive. We can't fail them again now that they're gone. We can't let their cases fade into obscurity. Can't let their families carry this burden without support. Can't let their killer, whoever they are, live freely while they lie in graves. That's not justice. That's not acceptable. And it's not inevitable. Change is possible. Justice is possible. But it requires people to care, to pay attention, to speak up when they know something, to demand better from the systems that are supposed to protect us. Barbara Breidor was 42 years old when she died. She was intelligent, funny, loved by her family. She struggled with addiction, with loss, with pain, but she was still a human being, still deserving of life, of dignity, of justice. She didn't get any of those things. What she got was a ditch, and silence. Kim Raffo was 35, a mother, a daughter, a person trying to survive. She was strangled and discarded like trash. Tracy Ann Roberts was 23. She was training to be a medical assistant, had a daughter, had a future. It was taken from her. Molly Dilts was 20. She'd only been in Atlantic City for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. And it cost her her life. For women. For families. For unsolved murders. One person responsible. Or maybe more than one. The investigators aren't certain. But what they are certain of is this. Someone knows what happened behind the Golden Key Motel in October and November of 2006. Someone knows who killed these women. Someone knows why they were positioned that way. Why their shoes were removed. Why they were left in that ditch. And that someone needs to come forward. Not for closure. That word is too simple for what these families need. But for justice. For accountability. For the chance to finally, after 18 years, have answers. To know what happened to the people they loved. To see the person responsible face consequences. That's not too much to ask. The Eastbound Strangler, if that's even the right name, has had 18 years of freedom. 18 years that Barbara, Kim, Tracy, and Molly didn't get. 18 years that their families have spent in limbo. That's enough. It's time for this to end. Time for someone to speak. Time for justice. If you know something, say something. If you suspect something, report it. If you were there. If you saw something. If you heard something. Even if it was 18 years ago. Even if you're not sure. Call 609-909-7800. Or submit a tip online through the Atlantic County Prosecutor's Office website. You could be the reason this case finally gets solved. You could be the reason 4 families finally get answers. You could be the difference. Barbara Breidor, Kim Raffo, Tracy Ann Roberts, Molly Dilts. Say their names. Remember their stories. And don't let them be forgotten. Because they mattered. They still matter. And they're still waiting for justice. November 20th, 2006. 2 women went for a walk behind the Golden Key Motel. What they found changed everything. And nothing. The bodies were discovered. The victims were identified. The investigation was launched. But the killer was never caught. And so the question remains, 18 years later. Who killed these 4 women? And why are they still free? Someone knows. And until they speak, these women are still waiting. Still lying in that ditch, metaphorically. Still calling out for justice that hasn't come. The case isn't closed. The story isn't over. Not yet. But it could be. With the right information. The right tip. The right person deciding to do the right thing. It could end. Justice could be served. Families could finally have answers. And Barbara, Kim, Tracy, and Molly could finally rest. But only if someone speaks. Only if silence is broken. Only if truth wins out over secrecy. That's the choice. And it's in someone's hands right now. Someone listening to this. Or someone they know. The choice is theirs. But the clock is ticking. And 4 women are still waiting.